what I would like to do here, first of all, I think that this idea is absolutely fascinating, to think about foundations, Waqf, Habus, ou Stiftung, ou Fondation, foundations, endowments, across time and across societies. And in fact, as we know from different research programs, and now it must be about three generations who are studying the foundations. I mean, for me, it's Waqf or Habus, but studying the foundations from the archival point of view, from the document point of view, but also bottom up, top down. We're beginning to realize that this is I should say, a sort of universal, although Pierre Charles just gave us all the contrary information about French history, about foundations in French history, it really is, in a sense, a universal institution, a universal structure, in the sense that all societies, men and women, need to find some kind of way, the society itself needs to find some kind of way to finance religious practices, education, but also charitable practices in society. There are many different ways that this is defined in one society to another, from one period of time to another in a given society. But in general, this is the case. And I would like to cite Manar Hamad, who has studied this. He gave 2 months ago a very, very interesting talk in the Waqf seminar on foundations which were from Babylonian times, Babylonian and Assyrian times, which was absolutely fascinating, from before Hammurabi. So showing that it really goes back in time, this structure to finance religious and charitable and public practices in society. We're leaving aside, I think I understood that quite well, we're leaving aside the family foundations for now, but in reality, as far as the Islamic world is concerned, and Christian and Jewish within the larger Islamic society, in reality, the family foundations and the public foundations have no difference whatsoever between them, in terms of creation of the foundation, in terms of the operations of the foundation, and even in terms of the final destination. Because I'll just say this and then I'll leave it aside. Because a family foundation in the Islamic world will always have, the final destination will be either religious or charitable. In other words, when the family dies out, or whatever line of individuals, not just family, of individuals has been defined as the beneficiaries, when that happens after 2, 3, 4 generations, if they happen to die out, there's always a provision that the revenues generated by the foundation will go to a religious destination or a charitable destination. So in reality, jurisprudence is exactly the same for the religious and charitable and the family foundations. Let me see. Okay. What I would like to do here, first of all, is go back to the fact of looking at the foundations in a comparative way, and even just staying within the Islamic world, we have a lot of comparisons, because I'm not going to really go outside of that because there are other specialists here, but there are many comparisons to be even thought about there, because we're talking, of course, all about, not to speak of Europe, because now that's another, the foundations are, the Islamic foundations are functioning in Europe as well, in the UK, for example, and other places. But up until, let's say, the mid-20th century or so, we were looking at all of North Africa, some parts of Sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East, I mean, Bilad al-Sham, Turkey, the Balkans, the former Ottoman Empire, going into Iraq, Mesopotamia, Indonesia, etc. So we're talking about a very, very large area of territory in which those foundations functioned at all times in one way or another. Even during the colonial period, I'll get to that, even during the colonial period there are differences. In some countries, in some areas, some countries like Algeria where, and Tunisia afterwards, where they were abolished, they weren't completely abolished in practice, and then they came back. We know in Tunisia, for example, with Nahda, that maybe about 4 years ago, something like that. About 4 years ago, the idea was introduced to bring back the foundations. 3 key words here: resilience, restoration, and revival. Especially resilience. That's really what I want to talk about here. I'm going to go back to that, but I want to first show you a triangle, and then I'll go back. The idea of resilience. This idea that Pierre Charles mentioned it, is that in a sense these foundations, I mean not in a sense, the raison d'être of a foundation is to exist forever. Which means, I mean nothing exists forever, but we do have foundations which go back 4 or even 5 centuries, which is a long time. In the sense that they are, I don't know how to say it otherwise, living institutions. When you think of main morte in the 19th century, the colonial administrators translated Waqf, translated Endowment as main morte, but it doesn't really, no, I'm not a specialist of main morte, so maybe somebody can define that further, but it doesn't, for me, it doesn't really define at all what a Waqf is about. Because a Waqf was created, the thing that's main morte about the institution are the beneficiaries in the corner, in the lower corner here. The beneficiaries, you cannot change the beneficiaries of a foundation. But you change the administrator, you change the assets, the means of revenue production. All of this changes over time, and sometimes it changes right after, very soon after a Waqf or a foundation is created. So having said that, so I put these little arrows to show you that it's a living institution. It's something that's constantly replenished, refurbished, rethought in terms of both on the ground decisions by the administrator, but also in terms of the religious law, the fiqh, and the same, I should say, again, for the Christian and the Jewish societies within the larger Islamic world, also have their own religious jurisprudential decrees and theories about the Waqf, about the foundation. So the religious law, the customary law, and of course the state law. So all of these factors, I'm going very quickly, I can go back afterwards, but all of this frameworks what's going on in one particular endowment, in one particular institution. And so I wanted to sort of show that it's like turning in and of itself, it's autonomous. Nobody can come in and say, this piece of land, I want to buy this piece of land, for example, or nobody can come in and say something, can change, there's no power that can come in and change what's going on in a particular Waqf. Of course, there's confiscation, of course we have many examples where that is not held to be true, but this is a theory, and in general, that is what happens. I have 2 diagrams that I'm going to show you. This diagram here is the traditional structure of a Waqf, or of a foundation. So it's in terms, you have to think also in terms of individual, which is very interesting because here, very often, Western scholarship, this has been said before, but Western scholarship says that the individual actions, the individual initiative is really a Western kind of thing. It's an Enlightenment idea. But in reality, we see that you might want to define it otherwise, but in reality, we see that the foundation, the Waqf, shows that the individual had an enormous impact on society in the Islamic world by the endowment system, by the foundations, other systems too maybe, but by the endowment. In the sense that, and I go back to say a man and a woman, gender blind, there's no difference whatsoever in terms of Islamic law for a man or a woman to create a foundation. It's the same. There are 3 things. You have to be post-puberty, free of debt, and a free person, not a slave, although there are contrary examples to that too. So man or woman makes a decision. It's a decisional making institution. Makes a decision to create a foundation. Why? The most important thing here again is on the corner there, the beneficiaries. The idea is to create a means of, not really production, but a means of generating revenue to sustain the life of beneficiaries, whether the life of a beneficiary, whether that is a religious place of learning, of cult, religious practice, or individuals in the case of a family or a private waqf. It's the same structure. I go back to say that again. It's the same structure. So the individual makes all the decisions. The individual, through a waqfiyah, through a charter foundation, the individual makes the distinction of who or what are the beneficiaries, and very often we have mixed, it's called mushtarak. We have mixed waqf or mixed endowment with the beneficiaries means, that's why you can't say private, public, it's really the same thing. The beneficiaries at the same time can be family members or other individuals, and the children and the children and the children of those individuals mentioned, named in the charter. And at the same time, other parts of those revenues, 3%, 5%, 10%, usually it's in percentages, qirat. Another part of the percentages can go to a mosque or a church or another religious foundation or charitable destination as well. That's what this is all about. So how to create a structure to ensure that those beneficiaries will be sustainably financed. This triangle shows that on the other side, so it's on the right side of the triangle, the endower puts into what they say puts into waqf. She or he has a private property, and that also has lots of things you can say about it, because a lot of times we don't have, it's not private property, it's state property, but in general, in terms of jurisprudence, it must be a privately owned property because you can dispose of that property as you like. Privately owned property generating revenue. So either a shop, a boutique, a bakery, a cafe, a private home, which you're going to rent out, or of course agricultural land, which has generated a lot of revenue for the endowments. So again, to make a long story short, because it's really a long story with lots of documents, fascinating documents, I should say, on this revenue-generating revenue-generating assets put into waqf by the endower. We had a workshop in Aix-en-Provence a number of years ago on the contracts, on the rent contracts of these revenue-generating assets, because you cannot, the theory is, although we do have exceptions, but the theory is once a property is put into the endowment, and there is the idea of main morte, once the property is put into the endowment, you cannot take it out. The status is waqf, or the status is endowment, and you cannot change that. But of course there are many, even within jurisprudence, ibdal and istibdal and other matters of exchange of property, and sometimes even property going out of that endowment, this triangle, going out of endowment into somebody's private property. We have examples of that. But in general, no. In general, the properties belong, they're owned by this juridical personality, and that is also a sort of this controversy in waqf studies and endowment studies. Can a endowment be defined as a juridical personality? I have always found that to be the case, even though there is nothing in the jurisprudence saying yes, this is it. It was thought of as another way, but it has its own life. And even, well, that's another thing. It has its own life. But its own life, as I said, again, one more time, it is a personal decision made by the endower who creates this. But that personal decision is mediated by social pressures. For example, a beneficiary, why would an endower, for example, choose one particular mosque, choose one particular church to be the recipient? I say that because waqf is very, very important for the Christians in Lebanon and Jordan, in Iraq, wherever Christian communities are. It's the same structure for within the whole Islamic world. So why does an endower choose a particular church or mosque or synagogue? In the case of Jerba, for example, we have Jewish Waqf, and not another one, because there's a social, societal connection, either with the individual or either with the family or the larger community. Why a choice of this particular destination for the beneficiary? Okay, I won't stay with that any longer, but this is the traditional structure of a Waqf or of a foundation where the endower makes the decisions, societal influences condition those decisions, and of course there's the framework of the Islamic law in this case, of law, religious law, of state law, which are sometimes contradictory or complementary, depends, and customary law, which is different from one area to another, from Syria to Sarajevo, where there are many Waqf, many endowments, so it's Europe, which has a whole legacy until today. I'm not sure I'll have time to go into that. But there's a legacy. Those Waqf created in the 17th, 18th, or 16th century, some of them continue to exist. They have transited through the communist period, where, of course, the religious foundations were abrogated. But they continue to exist in another form. They were called something else, but they continue to exist. And today, the post-communist Balkans, they continue to exist. They're called Waqf. But it's different. It's an evolution of the institution. I'm jumping ahead here, and then I will go back to some theories. Okay, I'm jumping ahead here to contemporary foundations in the Islamic world, and also within Europe, and also within the United States with the NAIT, the North American Islamic Trust in North America. I'm not really sure at all about South America. Never really found examples on that, but I didn't look. But it's probably very similar. Here, now we're in another period of time. We're in the very contemporary period. This structure is only valid for the last 15 years, or maybe, last 15 years. It began in around 1990, 1991. And here, we don't see the individual. The individual no longer makes a decision of who or what are the beneficiaries, no longer puts his or her private property, whether it's built property or agricultural property, into the endowment, no longer makes the decision of who is going to manage or administer the endowment, whereas before it was quite often, at least in Hanafi school, it was quite often the endower himself or herself who administered the foundation. Here the decision is left to an institution. So some parallels probably can be made with perhaps in France and certainly in the UK, that, or in Germany maybe, or other places. Decisions here are made by an infrastructure, by an institution, an association. I have specific examples in mind which I can give if a question is raised on that. An association, charitable association or a public association would be created, usually under the law of 1901. Pierre Charles? 1901, right?
In France, yes.
Yeah, under the law of 1901. And it is a board of directors of that association. I'm thinking, for example, there's an Islamic society, for example, Relief Society, the Secours Islamique, which is in different European countries and has public and charitable destinations, beneficiaries. Decisions are made by the board of directors. And an individual does not make any decision. An individual buys a share, an action, buys a share into that endowment. So we're talking about really, I kept my triangle to show you just the differences in the way that we can think about it. But here there's no decisional making power on the part of the individual. The individual buys a share. With the Islamic Relief Society now, it's 1,300 euros, something like that, for a share of this particular endowment. You buy into it, and you get a piece of paper saying you belong to this particular endowment. You belong to this particular Waqf. So the beneficiaries are not decided by the individual. The beneficiaries are decided by the association. The revenue-generating assets, that means the property, revenue-generating property put into that particular endowment, is not decided by the individual, decided by a board, as well as the management. So having said that, there are those two models in mind with variations, but really those are pretty much the way that you can think about it. I would like to talk now about the internal, keeping those triangles in mind, I would like to talk about the internal structure of Waqf, the internal structure which allows for resilience or fluidity. As you can see, within that triangle that I showed you, it turns around itself, but it turns within this larger framework that I had mentioned, the law, the religious law, state law, customary law. So there are a lot of controls on the decision made by the individual, especially on the operations and the functions. You can't just go out and rent your property any way you want. No, there are a lot of controls, and it goes through, at least in the Ottoman period, which means from basically the 15th and 16th century on. But before that, we have many, many, many thousands and millions of documents from that time in the different provinces, African, Asian and European provinces, showing us that, but it existed before that. We know it existed from at least the end of the Umayyad period, in any case. So, for this endowment system to continue to exist, there has to be fluidity, there has to be resilience. And one of the key ways to think about this is the fact that this Waqf, or the endowment, perhaps contrary to other civilizations even, is not just an elite structure. On the contrary, it's vertical. You have to think about it as horizontal and vertical, especially vertical. It goes way down deep into society. So that's what I happen to find, that's what I love to work on. I find it to be the most fascinating aspect of this particular institution, is that the ordinary person, it's very routine, there's nothing extraordinary about it at all. That's why we have millions of documents on them. That there's nothing extraordinary at all about the endowment. It is used by everyone. Up until the colonial period, there we start to have differences. But let's say then up until, say, the mid-19th, more or less, mid-19th century or later in some areas, this endowment is a tool, is an instrument used by the ordinary person. And we know that because when we look at the documents, when you sit in the archives and you look and look and look at these documents, you see that there are many, as they say in French, anonymous, I don't know how to say it in English, anonymous people, meaning you can't define them. You only have a name. It's not from a large, definable elite family. They're just ordinary people who might have a tiny little room somewhere, a small little vegetable garden somewhere, and they want to leave a trace after their death, because that's the key also. You choose the beneficiaries, and those beneficiaries will receive the revenues after the demise of the endower. So that's another key thing. So the ordinary man or woman, if they own a small little, or even it could be a movable item, it could be a chair, it could be a book, it could be jewelry, anything of value. We have many, many examples of that also amongst the Bedouin, for example, of jewelry and kitchen utensils being put into a Waqf, being put into an endowment and passed down from, it's usually from mother to daughter, etc., in terms of kitchen utensils. But getting back to that idea of the fluidity, the resilience for the ordinary person, vertical, going all the way down to the last level of society, I mean, owning at least something, using this structure. So that's something which is comparatively interesting to think about, because I'm not sure that's the case in other societies as well. So when I say that it's anonymous, that means that we only have one name of a man or a woman, and usually the daughter of or the son of, and it doesn't go any further than that. So we cannot identify who that person is, but the large, overwhelming majority, 90% of the endowments are of that kind. Of course, we have the sultanic Waqf, the large sultanic endowments, etc. We have them, of course, and they're easily identifiable. We know who they are, we know the property, but we don't know who the 90% of the other people are. We put their names and we say, okay, this person owned that property, because it's carefully identified, north, south, east, west, the property put into the endowment, so we can sort of put it on the map, but we don't know who these people are. And that's the interesting part, I think, about it. So it's a vertical structure. And it's resilient in the fact that there's no prohibition on who the beneficiary can be. You name the beneficiary as you want. What kind of property can be put into revenue generating property. There's no restriction on that whatsoever. And here I would like to mention what we call the cash waqf. The cash waqf. And here from the 16th century, so in Ottoman times, in the Balkans, and then it goes into the Arab provinces quickly afterwards. So it's a European structure coming from somewhere, I'm not aware, but coming from somewhere, this idea of cash waqf, meaning that you can create, you can put into your endowment property which is cash. And it's the rent of that cash, so the rent, I mean, the use of that cash going out, sort of like a small business loans or something, going out to whomever asks for it. There's a lot of documentation around that as well. And then they will have to pay back that cash to the Waqf. So instead of a house, instead of a cafe or a bakery or a hammam, a bathhouse, or a piece of land, at that time in ex-Yugoslavia, Albania, Macedonia, etc., we have a lot of these cash Waqf. And a Turkish researcher who's with INSEF, but he recently retired, Murat Çizekçi, such a very good friend, studied in detail these cash waqf from Bursa, from, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, I believe it was the 16th century, where overwhelmingly in the Turkish city of Bursa, so south of Istanbul, overwhelmingly, something like, I can't remember exactly, something like 70% of the endowments were based on cash at that time. And there was a fatwa given from the highest authority in the Ottoman Empire, giving the okay for this, approving this, generating, this how would you say, this means of production or of generating revenue, which at the time when we first began to study that, it was quite a surprise to find that. But now we see, yeah, it happened pretty much everywhere in the Ottoman Empire. Okay, just a few words now here about historiography of the study of Waqf and a periodization. I would like to talk about this, or at least just talk about it briefly, to show you that, going back to what Pierre Charles said, the sort of immortality, if you can say it that way, sort of immortality of the endowments. People die, but many people want to leave a trace after their death. Of course, legacy, inheritance, but you can't change anything about that. This is all regulated by whatever system you happen to live under, whether it's religious, whether it's state law, all of this is regulated, or very much so. What is interesting about the endowment, with the endowment system and leaving a trace of oneself after one's demise, is that in principle, an individual can take 1/3 of his or her property and create an endowment with that. Sometimes it's very substantial, sometimes it's just a tiny little portion of a house. You say like 1/3 of an eighth of this particular house will be an endowment. So there's a lot of accounting that goes with it. Not the part that I like, I have to say, but there's a lot of accounting that goes with it. What is interesting here is the immortality of the endowment that's created. Now, to look at keeping that in mind and to look at the periodization, this has been the case, give or take exceptions. This has been pretty much the case from the beginning. Let's say the Umayyad period, we have traces. Al-Kindi talks about the enormous amount of wealth already possessed by the endowments at the end of the Umayyad period. So what that means, like say 150 years or so after the beginning of Islam and the civilization, up until the colonization period, up until the French, English, French, British, Dutch, what have you, the European presence in the former, in the North Africa and Indonesia, etc. They come across this system where the wealth, a lot of this wealth, real estate wealth, and also cash waqf, which we find also in Indonesia. Daniel Chryselius had studied that. Has been sort of crystallized, or has been taken out of what they call the market system, has been taken out of the market system. I mean, that way of thinking didn't even exist in this particular structure, and was inaccessible to the colonial project. To make that land, to make that wealth, not just land, but the buildings, the cash, the agricultural property, to make that accessible to the colonial project, which means capitalizing those resources, one needs to remove them from the endowment system. So this endowment, the first triangle that I showed you, that is progressively being abrogated, abolished, in different ways, in different parts of the Islamic world, up until the mandates in 1946 in Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Jordan, Palestine. All of this is beginning to be changed. I don't have time now to go into the details, but you would see that triangular sort of system, which is autonomous, which molds the individual decision-making process and impacting, I would like to use that word very strongly, also influencing, impacting society. There was something that you said, just a second, let me try and find it. There was something that you said, but as I can't find it now. But that system, that endowment system of influencing the way, the course of society, influencing, impacting tendencies of society, now is going to be changed during the colonial period, and those properties will be sold off as private property. I should say also in Syria that this was the project of the mandate, but which never took place, which never happened, even though in 1920 it was on the books as one of the first things to do, was to sell off those endowment properties because of local opposition, because of what happened in other colonies, uprisings, etc., in terms of that project. It was on paper. There were studies being done, so there were 4,000 Waqf, 4,000 endowments which were identified, but that never came into action. It was only after independence in May 1949, under the Hosni Zaim government in Syria, that the Waqf were abolished. Were étatisés, made into state. I mean, the state took them over. There are many details to say about that. The state took them over. There was public bidding. There was public selling of those properties. And very often, in fact, the beneficiaries were in favor of that. So, and Syrian economists, there were two Syrian economists in the 1930s who wrote their dissertations here in Paris, another one in Lyon, who were in favor of dismantling, as I say, démembrer, dismantling the endowment system. So you have a lot of differences internally, externally, in relation to what happens with these properties. They're living. It's a living organism, as you can see. Okay, I only have 2 minutes left, but looking now into the post-colonial, although some say we're still in the colonial, but looking back into the post-colonial period, into everyday life, now we know that in the Gulf, we know that in other parts of the Islamic world, the endowment system, the Waqf, continues to be an instrument, a vital, essential, infrastructural instrument of generating and of sort of especially framework and giving the framework for channeling revenues into society in terms of the beneficiaries. I just want to show you this one more time. Here, on the right-hand side, which is the left-hand side, the right-hand side over here, the revenue-generating assets. When you think about Islamic finance, my last 2 words will be about this. When you think about Islamic finance, as you know, in the last, it's very recent, in the last decade or decade and a half, there has been an association between sukuk, so contracts, between sukuk and Waqf, or the endowment system, and also zakat being a means of cash flow into this. You can keep this triangular system into the endowment system, where now the endowment is not a structure in and of itself, but the whole thing has changed, and I'm working on the third triangle, or the third way of showing this, that the Waqf, or the endowment, now is no longer, although in some cases it is, but not within the system of Islamic finance where I'm talking about here, is no longer a separate infrastructural element, but has become part of a larger way of financing different systems, and it is associated with the sukuk. So there's an association now, and this is something new, there's an association now of the endowment system with new structures. They're not new, but with a new way of organizing them within the larger financial overstructure. Okay, my very last thing I would like to mention here. An international research program. We're in our very last year. It's called the GDRE, and it's an international research network on Waqf. And INCEF is here, so it's IFPO, École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales, Japan, Toyo Banco, Tunisia, Zayed, Berzait, Algeria, and us, the CNRS. So many people, I mentioned to you before that there are literally millions of documents which are available for the researcher to work on this system of endowment. I hope I gave you an idea of really how simple the system is, but how complex it has become in terms of societal practices. And about 10 years ago or so, a number of different researchers said that we would like to create a network to comparatively, just within the Islamic world now, and Christian, Jewish, and Zoroastrian, and also going back to, as I mentioned to you before, going back to Babylonian times, just within this very large area of the globe, but not to look at other places for now. I mean, the Japanese here work on Syria, by the way, to try to understand comparatively what's happening in a given time. For example, I just take, for example, 1810. 1810, what is happening with a particular rent contract on a property in an endowment? What's happening in Baghdad, in Damascus, in Cairo, in Sarajevo? So we're within the Ottoman world. And everyone then in this program, this is just an example, there are many examples, everyone then studies that particular kind of contract. It could be, for example, removing a Waqf, removing a property from an endowment and selling it off. Could be that kind of system, or that kind of contract. And we all study that kind of contract to see comparatively what is the jurisprudence on it, and according to the document itself, which goes through the law courts, what happens, so to speak, on the ground. So this is absolutely, for us, absolutely fascinating, and it shows the diversity of opinion and the diversity of use of this instrument in society. So I will stop there, and I jumped around quite a bit, but I had to, in a sense, to show you the complexity of the endowment system. So thank you very much.